Global Governance Futures is brought to you from the Global Governance Institute at University College London. This is a podcast about the challenges facing humanity and possible global responses. How does the world hang together? What has gone wrong? And what has global governance got to do with it? To learn more, please visit ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.
This is one of those conversations which I've really been looking forward to hosting, and it did not disappoint. Philip Cunliffe's recent book, The New 20-Year Crisis, offers a bracing, no-holds-barred critique both of Western liberal foreign policy as well as academic practice within the discipline of international relations, or IR. Philip charges that IR has largely succumbed to a liberal utopian vision of world order, a vision which neglects power in its analysis and as a result is left unable to think politically. As you can imagine, the book's argument received a spirited response from my students, and I've tried to capture some of their reactions in the questions which guide our conversation. Philip argues that our failure to comprehend the global political transformations currently underway not only prevents us from seeing how these changes spell the end of the US-led global governance project, but also robs us of the critical faculties to perceive new possibilities for world order.
There are opportunities to think kind of hopefully and creatively about the possibilities for new visions of international order and new visions for international cooperation. But it means also a willingness to cut away and jettison inherited legacies and institutions that are inherited from the past, and a willingness to be bold and creative.
This is Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. Dr. Philip Cunliffe is Associate Professor in International Relations at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction, University College London, where he researches and teaches on the topics of international order, multinational military intervention, and conflict management. We spoke with him in April 2024. Okay, well, it's great to have you here, Philip. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
This conversation is really inspired by your recent book, The New 20-Year Crisis, which, of course, echoes E.H. Carr's classic text, The 20-Year Crisis, which was published in 1939, and which is widely credited with having launched the academic field of international relations. Your book is an absolute pleasure to read, very incisive, a kind of no-holds-barred takedown of the way we as a kind of community of scholars understand and study global politics or international relations today. And, you conclude that the field is in serious trouble, and you have a very clear view as to why that is the case. But before we get into that, I'd like to begin, as we often do, by asking a bit about yourself and your journey to this point. So there are some passages in the book which did make me chuckle out loud, where you recount how your experience as a grad student has shaped your views on academic practices within international relations, especially regarding the internal dynamics of power and knowledge in the discipline. And I was wondering perhaps if you could elaborate there. What did you expect to encounter as a grad student in international relations, and what did you find?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm delighted that you found the book stimulating and useful, and the journey, I suppose, talking through my journey. As someone who's made the discipline of international relations their career, it was useful for me to think about the intellectual structure of the field through that, because I did my undergraduate between 1998 and 2002, and then I did my master's at Aberystwyth, which was specifically in international politics, 2003 to 2004, before I did my PhD at King's College London. So this is the peak of the moment of unipolar globalization, coming out of the dot-com crash through the bombing over Kosovo, the NATO campaign against Kosovo, the war and the launch of the global war on terror, and then the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. So all of this was swirling in the kind of scholarly and disciplinary debates at that particular point. I made the choice. So after my undergraduate, I had kind of spent a year kind of cooling my heels, I suppose, trying to work out what to do. But when I made the choice to pursue international relations as an academic career, to do a master's and pursue a doctorate, I suppose I was expecting a discipline that would be more serious about politics, I suppose. And I wasn't quite sure what that would look like or what that might seem like. But it seemed, the more that I kind of waded into the discipline, the less serious it seemed to me to be about politics. And so, and I grew to understand, I suppose, that this in fact was itself an artifact of unipolarity. So, in an era in which all questions of political power were essentially settled, the so-called end of history period in which the kind of basic configuration, political and social structure was taken to have been settled. And so the only kind of questions left were marginal questions or ethical questions, questions about developing humanitarian law, international criminal law, extending human rights, defending humanitarian ethics, or economic questions about improving economic growth. So in that context, it seems to me that the basic, so much about politics was taken for granted in terms of the way politics should function, the particular hierarchy of political power in the world. All of these questions were taken for granted because there was no serious challenge or contestation to American power. And so in that context, I think it was very easy for scholars and analysts and commentators, observers of all kinds, not just international relations academics, to take for granted, but also, I suppose, to not think in hard-headed political terms. And while that might be excusable that might be excusable among lay people, I suppose, it seemed to me, as time went on, it seemed to me increasingly inexcusable among international relations specialists that we could be so naive about basic questions of political power and to what uses and purposes power was put. And it took some time to work that through because my academic career was motivated by the effort and desire to critique humanitarian intervention as this kind of post-political use of military power. So military power that was no longer justified by reference to an idea of national interest or strategic interest, but was motivated by these grandiloquent claims of altruism and protecting even humanity. And so it was kind of the seeds for the 20 Years Crisis book were laid early on. And it took some time to kind of to blossom. But I suppose looking back, it was always peculiar to me, certain things that I noticed, I suppose, about the discipline. And one of them was the way in which I think we had become deeply naive was also having assumed that because we were further ahead in time, that previous questions from the past had basically been settled in the past. So one of the things we were taught, E.H. Carr's 20 Years Crisis book, like you say, kind of a classic in the field, and it's taught, it's taught in a sophisticated way, with plenty of contextualization of Carr's thought and as well as relation to his biography. They give kind of due attention to different parts of the book, all of this. And, he's taken as a heavyweight, serious thinker. But what we were told was basically that the way it was taught to us, and I think this is probably representative of the way it was taught in many kind of seminar rooms around the Western world, was that we'd been kind of idealistic in the past. E.H. Carr had corrected that. And thus now we're kind of more measured, we're more cynical, we're more wise, and therefore we can move ahead. we've swallowed the bitter pill of Carrian realism, and now we feel confident in straying further afield from the parameters which were set for us by Carr. And I realized that it was that assumption that was the bad one. And the claim that I make in the book is that, in fact, having assumed that we'd learned Carr's lessons, it allowed for this incredibly baroque, kind of esoteric blossoming of IR theory that, in fact, ended up reproducing precisely many of the pathological, what I think is essentially pathological forms of intellectual development that Carr himself had tried to cut back in the interwar period. And we'd recreated it thinking that we were so much wiser and more cynical than we had been back in the 1920s and 30s.
Great. Thanks, Philip. That's very helpful. So I think you've given us a sort of flavor of liberal utopianism, if you will, and the fragility and the blind spots, shall we say, within that framing. If we bring the book title into view here, The New 20-Year Crisis, which, as you say, is very much inspired by E.H. Carr's original 20-year crisis, which was 1919 to 1939. Perhaps we can just drill down a bit more into the parallels here between these two distinct 20-year crises over time. I mean, I noted down when I was preparing for this interview, that famous phrase, perhaps Mark Twain said it, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I mean, what kinds of parallels do you draw out between these two periods of time? And what might be actually novel about this 20-year crisis?
Yeah, so it's again, it's a great question. So Carr's claim is he writes the book in 1939 on the eve before it's published, just before the outbreak of the Second World War, at least with with Hitler's invasion of Poland. Though by the point at which everyone understands that the interwar order is falling apart, everyone accepts that. He claims that the seeds of this disintegration were sown in 1919 with the Paris Peace Treaties, essentially, and the rise to prominence of American power and all the idealistic illusions that were vested in institutions like the League of Nations, but also treaties like the Kellogg-Briand Pact that tried to outlaw war, the World Disarmament Conference that crumbled in the 1930s, and as well as hopes that were vested in the force of international public opinion and international law to restrain the exercise of power politics. So he claims that it's a single kind of block of time between the two world wars, but the seeds are kind of sown in the flush of victory at the end of the First World War, and shepherded by Woodrow Wilson's vision of being able to create a world around liberal internationalist principles of independent nation states built on the ruins of the European empires, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe, and that these would be integrated into this international organization that would be able to coordinate international affairs so as to gradually eliminate the prospect of power politics, essentially. Everything would be governed by law, norms, and economic growth. And so a lot of that seemed to me very similar to the kinds of politics that we saw in that period between 1999 and 2019. 1999, you have the high point. I took it as an important year because it's the year of the Second Chechen War, which would see Vladimir Putin become would kind of be elevated into the top tiers of Russian power as he began to replace the previous Russian president, Boris Yeltsin. But more importantly, it was also the year of NATO's war against Yugoslavia, the bombing of Yugoslavia, in order to end the counterinsurgency campaign against ethnic Albanian separatist rebels in Kosovo. And this, I think, was important because it was the first time that you had a humanitarian intervention that was authorized or took place without the support of the United Nations Security Council. And it was also the old Cold War era Atlantic Alliance justifying its military actions by reference to the need to defend human rights and to intervene, that they had the right to intervene in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. So it's the moment of liberal hubris with regards to military humanitarianism and human rights. And I make the claim in the book, at least, that this sows the seeds for the overextension of Western power that follows, the overreach that will inevitably end with the recoil that we see towards the end of the period. And the overreach, so Kosovo, I argue, lays the ground not only for the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which is almost universally now seen as a disaster, but is really understood in relation to the previous episode of the Kosovo intervention. But at the same time, also, Kosovo becomes the model. It's used by a revanchist Russia in due course in order to justify its own military interventions, even to the extent of, in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, the way in which the Russians justify the initial declaration of independence of Crimea from Ukraine before it's annexed is by reference to the same text, almost to the word, that was used by the International Court of Justice to justify Kosovo's secession from Serbia. And so basically the Kosovo intervention, I think, is an overlooked moment in which which becomes the paradigm for the overextension of liberal humanitarianism throughout the unipolar period, the invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, and then in due course the bombing of Libya in 2010, but also a license essentially for other countries to begin pursuing military intervention kind of willy-nilly. And in particular with the case of the Russian intervention, the Russia-Georgian war in 2008, where they carve up Georgia, setting up protectorates, very similar to the way NATO sets up Kosovo as a protectorate, and then eventually with the Russian military intervention in 2014 in eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. And obviously, I think similarly, by the time you reach 2019, where you have the Trump government of the day intervening more heavily in the Middle East, threatening kind of saber rattling against Iran, and just on the prospect of what would come as the global lockdown in the wake of the spread of the COVID virus around the world, it seems like it was drawing a line under that period. So the similarities are evident. The differences, I think, are many, and you could draw attention, I guess, to the fact that it's a unipolar world order as opposed to a multipolar world order in the interwar period. And unlike the interwar period, you don't have fascism as a real force in international politics. So in the interwar period, you do have a world which is ideologically divided, as well as multiple great powers challenging each other for supremacy. But it's also a world that's meaningfully ideologically divided between communism, liberalism, and fascism. And by the time you get to the new 20 years crisis, as I call it, between 1919 and 2019, what the difference here is very instructive, because liberalism faces no challenges. It reigns entirely supreme. And yet we seem to be constantly refighting wars against fascism. So all of the humanitarian interventions, whether against Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia, Serbia, whether against Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, whether against Saddam Hussein, and eventually, Vladimir Putin, there are always new crusades against fascism, new crusades against new Hitlers, and the stakes are always portrayed in terms of this imminent collapse of international order and slide into inevitable world war unless we avoid another Munich, avoid appeasement, and go to war. So that is an important difference, not least because it illustrates, I think, the way in which the interwar crisis is constantly repeated. And so the modification, the attempt or what I tried to do in terms of modifying the Carrian point is that Carr thought, I think, in terms of a pendulum in international politics, that we were condemned to oscillate between these excesses of liberal idealism and utopian hope about the ability to transcend power politics and to build institutions that would tame international order, and the swing back to sober realism, where we had to confront and deal with hard questions of political power. And it seems to me that it's not quite right. So, because what's so peculiar is the way in which we seem to recreate the interwar period ideologically and institutionally at repeated staggered intervals ever since the end of the Second World War. And so, instead of seeing it as a pendulum swinging between one extreme to the other, it seems to me more that the liberal international order, as it's recreated, and the way in which it's justified, it seems that we're kind of trapped in a holding pattern, it seems to me, that we keep on repeating, and that's for institutional, political, and ideological reasons. So those are two ways in which I caveat the Carrian critique in order to apply it to the changed context of the start of the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just doing some work at the moment on crisis, and it is quite hard to call, what is the cutoff in terms of demarking the crisis. I think you made a very good case of these, what you call the eerie parallels between these periods, but also some of those differences. But yeah, I mean, some might quibble and say, well, it's premature to say the crisis is over. For some, we seem to be living in a constant state of crisis. We hear Adam Tooze talking about polycrisis, we hear permacrisis, and we also hear, British politicians, European leaders increasingly saying that we're living in a, quote, pre-war age, which I think is resonant with what you were just conveying in terms of the ideological, institutional perpetuation, repetition of this notion of the breakdown of the interwar period. Would you agree?
Yeah, so I'm not, I can't, obviously, I'm making no claim to any kind of monopoly stake to crisis. So when I say it's the 20 years crisis, it's only applying a Carrian paradigm to a particular period of international history that I think can be draped over a certain series of events, or a narrative that can be draped over a certain series of events, and that has a very clear shape from tracing the arc from hubris, overreach, to recoil and delegitimation, and the return of unexpected great power challenges in kind of geopolitical rivalry between East and West, Russia and Western Europe and America, and obviously more recently China and America. So to that extent, there is, I think, that crisis can be traced. However, that's not to say that that it's the only form of crisis, or that there aren't other ways to describe what's happened since. I mean, it seems we've been, and this would seem to be borne out by the full-fledged Russian invasion of Ukraine a couple of years ago, that the conflict that was erupted in 2014, and again, I think as a result of the extraordinarily blithe and apolitical, astrategic thinking on the part of NATO and the European Union to push for and facilitate the expansion of NATO, in particular eastwards, that would inevitably, it seems to me, drag Ukraine into the vortex of geopolitical conflict between East and West. So the seeds were sown. You can see them kind of being cast early, but by 2014, with the Russian military intervention in eastern Ukraine, you already have a simmering kind of slow motion, what will become a simmering war that will become a kind of fully fledged proxy war by the 2020s. So that it seems to me legitimate to locate the crisis in that way, but beyond that, I think what we're seeing is these attempts to find new words to describe what's going on. They seem to me more to speak to the breakdown of established categories. and the inability really to get to grips with what's going on. So, permacrisis, polycrisis. It seems to me it's a generation of observers and politicians, political leaders, international bureaucrats, and so on, who are all struggling to get to grips with a world which they um, can't find the right institutions. They don't know which levers to pull. They don't have the right frameworks. And so they see kind of a world which is kind of being restructured and try to come up with these innovative new ways to describe them. But it seems it's, fairly, for the most part, not atypical in terms of the patterns of geopolitical great power rivalry that we've seen in the past. But you need to say something on a PowerPoint slide at Davos or whatever. And so they need to kind of innovate a new term which gives kind of appropriate gravitas to decision makers in that particular moment. So, that would be, I suppose that would be one thought. The other thought in relation to what you asked about the pre-war age, this is, again, there is an instructive difference with the interwar period that Carr was writing about, which is the fact that politicians don't seem to draw flack or be held to account for not being able to restrain or limit war. Because the interwar period, I mean, the famous or the most kind of iconic or notorious example of it, obviously, is Chamberlain, when he claims peace, the agreement at Munich with Hitler that carves up Czechoslovakia, secures peace in our time. And then in short order, Europe is at war again when Hitler invades Poland. So, and there, Chamberlain, it was a tremendous blow to Chamberlain's authority and prestige. And he was seen, it's kind of colored his entire historic legacy and reputation as this ineffectual, naive politician who was completely hoodwinked by fascist aggression and was unwilling to make the decisions that were necessary to restrain fascism. Anyway, and I'm not suggesting, not wanting to get into the argument about what Chamberlain could have or should have done. But what I'm saying is that there was a sense in the interwar period that it was the responsibility of politicians to prevent war and to find ways of avoiding conflict, and because they had a sharp feeling for the dangers of great power war. Whereas today our politicians can blithely talk about us moving from into, like you say, a pre-war age, and we can't seem to hold them to account for their failure, because if it is a pre-war age, surely they're responsible for it. The fact that they've led us into a world which is more conflictual and more dangerous, it doesn't seem to me it's legitimate to lay the blame for that purely at the feet of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. That would seem to me to be far too easy, as well as letting off our own politicians off the hook. And if they are, as they claim to be, politicians with democratic accountability, unlike Putin and Xi, then it seems to me it's legitimate to ask, how did they take us into this situation, and how can they expect to not to be held to account for leading us into a pre-war age, because that should be on them.
Right. So the question of how we end up in this situation, the question of the redundancy of our inherited conceptual apparatus, the frames through which, our political leaders, our political systems of thought, our research paradigms, the frames and the lens through which they view the world. I mean, you've mentioned the liberal international order. Perhaps we'll drill down on that a bit. So I've also found your book very helpful in a project which I'm working on around this notion of global governance in crisis, or a crisis in global governance, or a crisis of global governance. And there's quite a lot of our colleagues who really still feel that whatever this is in terms of a crisis and its magnitude, that crisis will ultimately be contained, will be managed within the framework of the international liberal order. Now, you're really advancing a strong claim that is fundamentally mistaken. And you say, and I quote, that we are actually living through a structural reconfiguration of international order and a transition to a genuinely internationalized world. Now, I find that very helpful as a fault line in the debate. It's very clear what you're advancing as a claim. I would love to know what makes you so convinced that this is indeed a change of the system rather than simply a change within the system.
Yeah. So, been talking about international relations for all the conceit, I suppose, within the discipline and claims of having transcended Eurocentrism and what have you. When we're talking about international relations for over the cycle of the 200 years of the modern international state system, so much of that is still the European era. Even if it's talking about decolonization in the 1960s and 1970s. So that still is, it seems to me, very much a Eurocentric vision of world order. And there's been many efforts and critiques of all sorts of stripes and flavors that have tried to kind of intellectually transcend the Eurocentric international order, with the most recent form being the kind of decolonial critique. But I think we can be more confident that it's been, as I say, genuinely internationalized, in the sense that the international order now incorporates great powers that are fully outside of the old international order, in the very basic sense that the two most populous countries on earth, both non-white, with India and China, are not only nuclear powers, which they have been for decades now, but also also significant economic powers in their own right. And China, the most powerful industrial country in the world. The economic growth in India is expected to, if it continues as projected, India will pull abreast of China and the old Western economic powers in due course. And it's also worth bearing in mind they were both colonized states, and to various degrees. China was, if not directly kind of colonized to the extent that India was, it was very much subjugated and pulled apart by great powers, and bound up with all sorts of humiliation in terms of the international treaty system and the concessions it had to make to European trading outposts and imperial powers from the outside. And so you have these two countries that have essentially established themselves as independent poles in the international system. And that seems to me to signify a significant break, a genuinely internationalized world. So it's not international relations in terms of, Italy, Germany, France, or Britain and America, or, Russia and Germany and so on, but genuinely a world in which, like I say, the two most populous countries in the world are fully protagonists within it at the geopolitical level, at any rate. So that's a genuinely internationalized world. I think that geopolitical polarization will also begin to, if not disintegrate, certainly begin to remold and reshape the institutions through which politics has been done, and the institutions of global governance. And some of this is seen in initiatives such as the Belt and Road, in discussions of the Indo-Pacific, in the Asian Investment Bank, which China has used to deploy its funding and financial kind of support to client states and allies abroad. Also in terms of geopolitical rivalry in areas that have hitherto not seen or haven't seen geopolitical rivalry for a long time, such as the Sahel and in Africa. And so all of this seems to me that we're seeing a genuine restructuring of international order. I don't think it doesn't mean, I think, that we'll that the United Nations is on the brink of collapse the way that the League of Nations was, or that the international economy is about to crumble away or anything like that. But we are seeing, I think, a restructuring, a redistribution of power. And inevitably, as those tectonic plates shift, then the structures that are placed on top of that will also they'll have to be reshaped in due course. And so it's a claim that's at once more modest compared to some of the more grandiloquent and sweeping claims that have been made in the discipline about how everything has changed and nothing is like the past. It's more modest because all I'm saying is, in a way, it's a return to the pattern of geopolitical rivalries in the past. but it's also a claim that's more far-reaching, because I'm saying its consequences haven't really been absorbed by thinkers and analysts within the discipline, and we're still too used to thinking in terms of American power and taking American power for granted, and without thinking through how all this geopolitical rivalry will reconfigure all of our basic assumptions about what happens in world politics, what happens in international order, and how institutions function. And I think that's already, evident. You can see it in the way in which some of the unexpected characteristics, for instance, of the Gaza war, or the Americans' response to Ukraine and Gaza happening at the same time. So yes, that would be my a somewhat lengthy response to the question.
That's great. And, I think the way you lay that out, it poses a daunting but also a very exciting sort of opportunity for students of global governance today to try and make sense of what's going on. And, you do have a very good turn of phrase, and there's this wonderful line, and I'm going to paraphrase it a bit. This notion that sort of global governance will be exposed as, and I quote, the utopian dream of the receding era of unipolarity. I really like that. So I think you've given us some sense of what this unipolar imaginary is and what are its implications for thinking politically. But I did want to just push a little bit more, and I think you have already, qualified this to some extent, but is sort of the notion of unipolarity as American-led world order, is that doing a bit too much work here in the argument? China does, at least rhetorically, support a project of global governance, whatever that may look like. Global governance does have a longer pedigree than, say, 1945. And I suppose, just speaking personally, the more I grapple with the multi-layered complexity, entanglement of global politics, the more I am averse to really concluding that any single framing of a problem can make sense. So I wanted to invite you perhaps to respond to some of those thoughts. Thanks.
No, sure. Yeah. So, I mean, the work, for instance, some research I've been working on for a very long time, and I had to put it to one side, in fact, partly to finish the Carr book, has been looking at the impact of how a new distribution of power impacts on peacekeeping, which was one of the core security architectures of the era of unipolarity, and I think is, peacekeeping is part of the security arm of global governance across the last 30 years or so. And so, there's a number of possible scenarios you can extrapolate and draw out, but it doesn't seem to me, for instance, that peacekeeping is going to disappear. So peacekeeping was born in the bipolar era of the Cold War, so it's kind of it's one of those institutions, I suppose, of global governance that emerges in an era of geopolitical rivalry, but it really explodes in the era of unipolarity. And I think it's safe to infer that it's going to be restructured as a result of if we're in a bipolar world or a multipolar world, whatever it looks like, it's going to look different. And so my research was trying to map it out, but I don't think it's going to end. What I think is likely to happen, depending on whether we're in a multipolar world or a bipolar world, my research claims, for instance, that peacekeeping will be restructured. It's possible the missions will become smaller. They'll kind of return to a more restrained paradigm of the Cold War era, where you have small peacekeeping missions, which are more based on monitoring and observation rather than, say, the grandiloquent projects of reconstruction or building, so-called liberal peace building, that were intended to restructure whole societies around the market, around human rights, around multi-party democracy. So that's the kind of change that I think we'll see. And, how significant is it? How important is it? If you're looking at the level of peacekeeping, that's a dramatic change from what has been a dominant pattern for decades. Will now be transformed into something which looks like a return to the past for peacekeeping. So it's kind of a back to the future style argument. And I imagine it'll be similar in different domains of global governance. And certainly great powers, whether it's Russia with its attempt to build the Eurasian Union, or say Russia-China axis with the Shanghai Cooperation Council, or whatever China's doing in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, those great powers will attempt to throw up these so-called public goods. They'll seek to provide public goods by which they will draw in allies and clients and seek to project their power and embed it in institutions. But rather than it being all dominated by a single state on the lines of the unipolar superpower, hyperpower of the last 30 years, we'll see a world which will have, I think, not only that geopolitical rivalry between states, but also perhaps a rivalry that's at the level of competing regional orders, competing international institutions as well. Perhaps more so-called forum shopping behavior among states. These kinds of, I think, the devil will be in the detail, but I'm sure the devil will be there.
Yes, and I suppose the devil perhaps won't have liberal characteristics. That's the possibility that you're advancing here. And I did want to ask about that. I mean, the book obviously paints a fairly unflattering portrayal of liberalism, at least in terms of its utopian refusal, if you will. Of course, there are many out there who would say you still have to give liberalism its dues, that it has had some notable successes over the past 75 years. So I wanted to ask, is there anything in your view, what is the future of the liberal project, shall we say, which is a very big question, I realize, in terms of the liberal project within global politics, and what is it that is worth really salvaging from liberalism after the age of unipolar globalization?
Yeah, again, it's a great question. And I think it's incumbent on any critic to recognize the allure and appeal of the thing he's criticizing, he or she is criticizing. And so in this case, there is, I'm happy to pay homage, I suppose, to the allure of international liberalism. And it is very alluring, the idea that it's possible to transcend the kind of dirty, grasping character of power politics with all of its diplomatic intrigue, irredentism, the petty jealousies of squabbling states, crude kind of greed and expansionism and cynicism, all of the things that we kind of associate with power politics. I mean, all of those elements are, genuinely there. And so the idea that it would be possible to restrain that and to turn international politics into a tribunal or, a panel of arbitration before a court, whether it's, the International Court of Justice or an arbitration body for the World Trade Organization, or there is something genuinely alluring about that, as well as the more kind of cosmopolitan fringes of that vision as well. A world of where people can kind of freely move without worrying about whether or not they can get a visa or whether or not their passport will allow them to get into a particular country. They can freely move and seek to pursue their lives in all sorts of different places and different contexts without hindrance or having to be subordinated to the grasping bureaucracies of the security state. So all of that is very alluring, but nonetheless, it is something, like I say, which is receding into the past. And if there's anything that can be salvaged, I suppose I would say two things. One is, I think that it's not, we never had it, the liberal era that we're leaving was never that especially liberal or appealing either. If we compare it to, say, the kind of the pre-war liberal order that ended in 1914, for instance, it's in many ways much less ambitious, much less appealing. It was certainly less peaceful. And it was a liberal order in which you already had these tremendously illiberal, anti-liberal concentrations of power in large security states, in large military industrial complexes, what have you. And those were always going to play the serpent, they were always going to play the serpent to the paradise. Those security states and structures that were inherited from the dark history of the 20th century. And you only need to think about the war on terror, for instance, and how that already kind of began to chisel away at the more, the kind of hopes for the liberal order coming out of the end of the Cold War. So if there are things to be rescued from, or things that we can still seek to salvage from liberal internationalism for the future, I'd say perhaps it would be to reframe the way in which we understand liberalism, both with respect to states and with respect to individual rights. So I think the lesson of the era of unipolar globalization and the rules-based order, the liberal international order, whatever you want to call it, it seems to me that it's clear that we can't rely on, we can't expect our individual rights to be defended at the transnational level or at the supranational level. So the era of human rights, where rights are understood as something to be guarded by international courts or by NATO or by the United Nations, that's the era of the global war on terror. It's the era of these endless crusades for human rights and the genesis of the forever wars. And so to reframe, if we reframe rights as that we need to protect our individual liberties, civil liberties and political rights and so on, they need to be protected within the nation state where they're connected to political agency, where citizens have actual more political control than they do at the supranational level. That would be a welcome gain and advance for liberal politics, or for any kind of meaningful politics of progress, as if we understood our rights as something that are best defended at a national level rather than a supranational level. And I suppose the other thing would be to think about international cooperation that along similar lines is based at the level of interstate cooperation. So genuine, there is the possibility, I think, as we exit the liberal international order, to recover a deeper and more meaningful and more authentic vision of internationalism, which is to say cooperation between states at the interstate level rather than supranationalism or transnationalism, where cooperation or integration at that level is squirreled away into remote places in which there's no democratic oversight or accountability, whether that's council chambers for the European Union, kind of Davos kind of get-togethers for the global elite, or particular kind of international institutions, whether it be the WHO or world trade bodies. I think there is a genuine opportunity to recreate internationalism anew, and that should be something that should be welcomed. And there are plenty of ways to imagine that, to envisage that, to work at it in a way that brings international cooperation closer to ordinary people. And hopefully in that way it becomes possible to anchor it in popular will, to make it more legitimate and hopefully therefore more enduring in the 21st century.
So you raised the spectre of the war on terror and the long shadow that it continues to cast over global politics, over liberal domestic politics, especially in the West, but all around the world. If we return to the academic salon for just a minute, you reserve some of your harshest judgment for the so-called constructivists and critical theorists in international relations. And you suggest that they both embody a particularly kind of pernicious, shall we say, form of utopianism. And I quote that they neglect the factor of state power and they overestimate the possibilities for voluntarily reshaping international politics. Now, I wanted to ask you to just tease that out a little bit, but I also wanted to just add the addendum. There is in a striking passage, you go so far as to declare that the infamous Karl Rove, who I believe was the deputy chief of staff to George W. Bush during the war on terror, you declare Karl Rove to be a constructivist theorist. Perhaps you can illuminate us on that as well.
Yeah, so Karl Rove, he was one of these, he was always cast by Democrats and liberals as one of the villains of the the villains of the peace during the global war on terror, as the kind of eminence grise behind, or one of the eminence grise behind the Bush administration. And he was an official in the two Bush administrations during which you had the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and the global war on terror. And he is reputed to have said, well, when after Baghdad fell to American forces in 2003, is reputed to have said, "We're an empire now. We can do what we want. We make our own reality." When he was challenged in some, Beltway think tank discussion or something like that. And so this idea of making, I was very struck when I came across the phrase, because this idea that reality is something entirely plastic and malleable, and that you can reshape it according to your will, and that you can take for granted that you have the power to do so. He was obviously talking about, he's a very, that was again this kind of moment of imperial hubris, and he's talking about American power. But the way in which he envisaged international politics, it seemed to me to resonate with the way in which it become fashionable to talk about international politics among certain strains of IR theorizing. And so the grand claim for constructivists and critical theorists was, the world is plastic, it's changeable. We have agency, we can change these things. We don't have to accept that the world is nothing, that international politics is nothing but rivalrous alliances and arms races and militaristic builds up and expansion and war. If we're willing to think of our own agency, then we can reshape the world into something which is more appealing and peaceful. And so they both Karl Rove, what the quote from Karl Rove exposed or clarified for me was the fact that they both see the world in these completely plastic terms, and that's because they both take American power for granted. So I think, constructivism and this is perhaps a tad ungenerous, but I'm going to say it nonetheless, but I think it can be seen as the theory of the NGOs. So it's a theory of the NGO world. It's, you have, you reshape states' identities through the actions of civil society, which is to say, a plethora of NGOs that are funded by Western agencies in one form or another, or Western states. They can remake states, and we will have states that are no longer so belligerent, so nationalistic, so xenophobic, so ugly. So the world is plastic. But of course, that takes for granted a world in which there are no competing rival centers of power. It's a world. It only looks plastic from the viewpoint of Washington D.C., where it looks like you can do whatever you like. You can kind of bomb countries as you will. You won't be stopped by. There's no one who can check you. There are no kind of consequences that will come back as blowback to kind of necessary to call into question your authority or your status. And so that's what I meant by saying that Karl Rove was a constructivist. Because like constructivists, even if they were on the other side of the political and ideological spectrum from Karl Rove, they took for granted American power in a way that was naive, because, Karl Rove thought that he and the Bush administration were going to build a flourishing liberal democracy in Iraq. All they really ended up doing was boosting the power of Iraq's old rival Iran. And Iraq has effectively become, it seems to me, it's more or less a satellite now of the mullahs regime in Tehran, and that was very predictable. And indeed, it was predicted, by people who knew better than Karl Rove about the balance of power in the region and how that would factor out once you'd shattered the unitary Iraqi state and it became a more kind of ethnically based federation, that inevitably it would be a boost to Iranian power. So that's the unipolar imaginary, as I call it. It's that outlook that's shared by Karl Rove and by constructivist theorists and by critical theorists too. The conceit that if we're willing to imagine things differently, we'll be able to escape the past. And I wanted to suggest it's things aren't so easy.
Yes, I just remembered that Joycean quote. What is it? The past is a nightmare that I'm trying to wake up from.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of the claim that I tried to. Maybe I don't make it explicitly enough in the book, but I think in many ways the 20th century is an attempt to, and this is part of Carr's critique. It's the attempt to give answers to the 19th century. And Carr thought that it did have, the 20th century would find the answers. And it seems to me now that we're in the 21st century that we didn't find the answers in the 20th century. So I'm hoping, or my hope or wager in the book is that at least in the 21st century, that we hopefully don't keep on repeating the conceits and the delusions of the 20th century, because that would truly be catastrophic. But at the moment, it seems to be the way we're going.
So there is another kind of utopianism that you critique in the book, which you refer to as disaster utopianism, which is specific to the scholarship which has emerged around the climate crisis or around the issue of ecological collapse. This drive towards some kind of planetary politics as an emergency response to these geophysical dynamics, which now seem to be crowding in onto the body politic. And you really push back against that. I mean, you see a lot of that response as, and I quote here, wallowing in the cloying melancholia of eco collapse, and you really reject their version of a pessimistic understanding of global politics that follows from their analysis. So I wanted to ask you, where does your analysis leave us? I mean, some might see it also as presenting a rather bleak picture. The return of the nation state, managed anarchy, the perpetuation of geoeconomic rivalry in a context of, say, exponential competition over rare earth minerals in the seabed of the Arctic. And elsewhere, you do indicate that, there is a certain sense that the reconfiguration that's underway might be welcome, that it promises, and I quote, a genuinely internationalized world of politically self-sufficient nations. Now, my understanding is that Carr himself concluded that the nation state was vanishing from history. You don't see that transformation on the horizon. So I suppose the provocation would be, what do you say to those who argue that there are serious global problems like ecological collapse or nuclear weapons proliferation, or even, say, economic inequality, which do require some kind of global solution, cooperation, governance? Are you leaving them on the beachhead, so to speak?
Yeah, so I suppose my answer would be the following. So there was this move by among certain theorists to make the claim of kind of introducing, as you put it, biophysical, bringing in theory into, or international relations theory, to relate to some of the ecological challenges we're facing by thinking, bringing these biophysical processes at the level of the planet into view within the way in which we think about international relations, and to bring it into focus. And my quarrel with that is that, again, it's by doing so, it's an effort, it seems to me, to introduce kind of a level of focus or analysis that in which power and the challenges or the contestation over power fades from view. So it shares the same unipolar imaginary. It's a world in which political power is not contested. There are no challenges or really meaningful contests over political power. And so it's a world in which it's entirely within our will to, it's simply up to essentially to the American empire whether or not global warming can be tackled. Or whether or not, what the response would be to biodiversity loss, or whether or not, the Amazon, deforestation in the Amazon can be stopped. And so the effort to look at that, to think in those terms, it seems to me, is deliberately bleaching out questions of political power, and therefore shares the same kind of liberal naivety that was characteristic of the unipolar era. So that's my quarrel with it. And I think towards the end of the period of the 20 years crisis, it took on this deeply, as I put it, this kind of cloying melancholia, this kind of being happily mesmerized by the prospect of ecological collapse as something which was an imminent prospect rather than something which I think is a more distant prospect, and kind of bringing it forward in time. And it seemed to me that was essentially ideological more than real, in the sense that it was expressing the melancholia of the end of the American-led world order. a world order in which Hillary Clinton had lost to Trump, which was a tremendous shock to so many liberal internationalists and critical theorists and constructivists and many of the scholars and students of international politics for whom it was inconceivable that an America First politics would return or emerge in the 21st century. And so this is what seemed, I think that was the disaster they were really talking about when they were talking about kind of imminent ecological collapse. So this is what I tried to do following Carr in the book, is always to submit whatever claim has been made, to think about what it tells us or how it's refracted through questions of political power and competition. And claims about biophysical processes and the collapse of ecological systems in the context of 2019 and 20 seem to me to be expressing, as I say, a deep resentment and sadness and bitterness resulting from the way in which the hopes or possibilities for global change seem to be receding, or at least a certain kind of global political change. Now, I don't deny that we're going to need international cooperation in the 21st century, far from it. But it seems to me that what's clear at the end of our 20-year crisis is that we won't be able to meet those challenges with our existing structures of cooperation, which it seems to me, which I call kind of supranational or transnational, to indicate the fact that they're increasingly exposed as illegitimate. They're increasingly remote and detached from structures of democratic accountability. They're challenged by populists, left, right, and center increasingly. And so all of those institutions don't seem to me to be fit for purpose. So if we are to have any kind of cooperation to meet genuinely global challenges of the 21st century, we're going to need to recreate all of our institutions. And that seems to me, again, that's a hopeful prospect, not a negative one, because it's possible that if we rebuild them and build them better, that it will be possible to root them in democratic legitimacy more effectively. And that's to say they need to be closer to popular, they need to be able to absorb popular input better. They need to be closer to the citizen bodies within states. They need to have ways in which they can be held to account by democratic majorities. And that all seems to me to push for a vision of international cooperation that is interstate, so genuinely international in the sense of cooperation between nations, just to say democratic bodies of people, sovereign states, rather than these remote institutions that are deliberately insulated from popular pressure. So, and this is where, in your final point, this is indeed where I depart from Carr. So Carr vested his hopes notoriously in the Soviet Union, but also other kind of large entities. He thought a future in which was dominated by the US and by the USSR was a world in which small states, nation states, were being kind of whittled away by these enormous concentrations of power. And I think that, it seems to me, would be, again, that would be something which would be, as the 20th century has shown, to be a dead end, essentially. And so that there is no escaping the question of having independent sovereign nation states. That's not to say that, the map should stay the same, or that we have to take any given nation state as, fixed forever or intrinsically legitimate, but that the nation state is a model, that we need it, which is to say that we need sovereignty, it seems to me, as a model. The national sovereignty is a model of political action, political self-sufficiency, free from external constraint, seems to me to be still the most effective way to mount politics and to undertake meaningful international cooperation. And without that, then we won't be in any fit state to meet the global challenges of the 21st century.
So we are rolling to a close. I suppose I am very tempted, and I can't resist asking. I am very wary of labels. Clearly, Philip, you're not a world order romantic or a world order utopian. I am curious to ask whether you would describe yourself as realist, although in the book you say it's probably already too late to make realism more real again. But I'm also curious to ask whether you would self-describe as a as a pessimist. Robert Cox famously did self-describe as a pessimist, which he understood as essentially sort of operating within the bounds of what he called feasible transformations. And I was wondering whether that resonates at all with yourself.
Yeah, so I wouldn't. I think, in terms of the discipline, it's an open question whether or not realism can, like I say, be made more real again. In the sense that so much of what realism is at the moment, it seems to me, has become it's kind of surrendered too much to its opponents, because so much of realism is international, kind of fairly esoteric, interesting, no doubt, and stimulating, but nonetheless esoteric questions of international political theory that are remote from questions of power politics as classically understood. Now, of course, I mean, there are still kind of serious old-fashioned realists such as Stephen Walt and J.G. Mearsheimer, who plug away with the old-fashioned power political conception of realism, for better or for worse. But as I mean, Mearsheimer can claim to be the granddaddy, I suppose, of structural realism at this point. But it's not clear to me that there are many people necessarily waiting to replace him, or the discipline is going to be able to adapt in a meaningful way to the challenges that are confronting us. And there are some serious and intelligent realists around, such as Patrick Porter at Birmingham here in the UK, or Stephen Wertheim in the US, and there are others as well. In addition to those I already mentioned. But it's not, seems to me, that a few names don't necessarily make a kind of are enough to address the deep intellectual maladies of the discipline as a whole. So, we'll see. I think anyone who is serious about political power would have to describe themselves as a realist at some point. But obviously, realism is almost always qualified, whether it's classical realist or structural realist or liberal realist or, kind of neo-realist or democratic realist or something like that. So I would describe myself, I suppose, as if I had to label myself in the context of the discipline, I would describe myself as something like a democratic realist, which is to say that anyone who's serious about preserving, and this is drawing on the Machiavellian tradition of political realism, which is to say not Machiavelli just understood as the kind of simplistic master of cunning and guile, but someone who took the question of civic republicanism, civic life, and national independence, or civic independence in the case of the Italian city-states. He took that very seriously and understood that if you were interested in questions of freedom, you had to be interested in questions of political power, and that only power can check power. If you want to check power, you need power to do so. So in that kind of vision of political realism, I think, is the one that I would subscribe to. So Machiavellian political realism, understood with the rich tradition of civic political thought, which is usually kind of truncated when Machiavelli is dealt with or thought about in the discipline. I'm not a pessimist. I would say I'm in fact optimistic, in the sense, at least, that I think we have opportunities in the reconfiguration of world order. And there are opportunities to think kind of hopefully and creatively about the possibilities for new visions of international order and new visions for international cooperation. But it means also a willingness to cut away and jettison inherited legacies and institutions that are inherited from the past, and a willingness to be bold and creative. And that seems to me that the rewards for that are greatest at points of systemic rupture, which we seem to be going through. So there's no reason not to be bold in those claims, rather than, pessimistic or wallowing in the kind of melancholia of collapse. So all of those things seem to me to motivate hope in a way that's that offers it, if not as realistic, at least as a worthwhile endeavor, and something which has the character of should hopefully energize us rather than debilitate us.
I think that's an excellent place to close. Obviously, perhaps the most important reason why we're having this conversation and why this podcast exists is because we have a responsibility to our students and young people in the seminar room, outside the seminar room. We are, I suppose, in the business of trying to equip them with the intellectual ideas, with the critical ability that can allow them to navigate what is an increasingly messy, complex, entangled, difficult global political situation. I suppose I'd be curious to ask, how do you really get students to understand, to really grasp that message, which is, how to navigate both the power political and the often decisive impact of power, while also, being sensitive to the fact that a lot of young people do come into our seminar rooms with sometimes ambitious, sometimes more modest utopian aspirations.
Yeah, I would say, I suppose, the utopianism of power is something to be avoided, and that seems to me to have been the kind of the utopianism that we've had thus far over the last 30 years. Is this utopianism of seeing all problems as something which is elsewhere and abroad. That for those who were interested in kind of saving the world, it was something which you did in a village in Africa or some, kind of embattled enclave with NGOs and UN peacekeepers in some poor peripheral part of the international system. So all of our problems lay, all the challenges, the meaningful challenges, kind of lay elsewhere in the form of, essentially kind of mopping up the periphery of the international system. And that in itself, it seems to me, is a fairly, that in itself is a fairly grim order of liberal policing. So if we can leave that behind, it seems that to me that would be positive. But also the lesson of the populist revolts that have helped to precipitate the end of the liberal international order, the lesson of that is also that there are plenty of challenges at home, and that everything that we took for granted about the stability and solidity of our institutions and our civic life and public life, none of those things should be taken for granted at home. And in fact, that they were much more rotten and hollowed out than anyone had dared to imagine. And so it seems that there are plenty of challenges that can be addressed without needing to travel kind of and seek to resolve challenges abroad. That there's plenty of stuff for those motivated students at the start of their careers or still in study, not to think simply in terms of outside, but also of inside and domestically. So that would be one thought. I suppose another thought would be not to accept the legacies of the past. It seems to me, to some extent, each generation has ended up being trapped in the inherited legacies of the previous generation. And so one injunction would be to not to allow themselves to be blackmailed by their elders into repeating the same problems. So when we're warned about, kind of that it's the 1930s again, that it's the imminence of a fascist takeover, unless we do this thing that is being kind of, this one thing, or vote this particular way, otherwise it's going to be Nazi Germany again. Those kinds of deeply manipulative moral blackmails that are part and parcel of the way in which, unfortunately, liberal politics has done so much in the West, that they should refuse that. Which isn't to say they need, liberalism needs to be jettisoned in its entirety. That's not what I'm saying, because I made clear earlier. But that as if they are to if these people that come into our seminar rooms, like you say, are to really be able to kind of stand upright and see further ahead, then they'll need to be willing not to be blackmailed by their elders and their superiors.
Yes, we might call it a kind of cultivating a kind of personal autonomy or sovereignty, even the ability to think for yourself and to arrive at your own considered conclusion.
Indeed.
Well, Philip, I want to say many thanks. Thank you for indulging me in all these questions. We run over a bit. I really enjoyed the conversation. You really conveyed your trademark eloquence. It's been very insightful. I think it's a testament to what is a very clear-eyed and clear-sighted argument in this book, which really deserves to be read and to be debated. And I'm looking forward to bringing it into the classroom next year in my own course. So thanks so much again. Look forward to seeing you on campus soon.
Yeah, me too. And thank you very much for having me on, Tom, and for such thoughtful questions that have also made me think, I hope, more clearly and more deeply about the issues I raise in the book.
Thanks so much, Philip.
Thanks for tuning in to Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. If you liked this content, please do leave us a comment and subscribe. If you're new to the show and you want to get a list of our favorite books, other resources, listen to past shows, and to join our community, go to ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.